It, it's a real pleasure to come back to the NIH. I left here 14 years ago, and I guess you actually can come back home. We're going to talk about cancer screening. We're going to talk about overdiagnosis. This is a subject which is incredibly emotional to some people. Indeed, as I see Dr. Moyer out in the audience, I remember the most controversial statement that I have made over the last 30 years is I have tremendous respect for members of the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. I got my life threatened for saying that. I am a medical oncologist and an epidemiologist. I work for the American Cancer Society as well as for Emory University. I also have a gig with Turner Broadcasting and CNN and do some consulting for a number of government agencies. I also published a book about 3 years ago that also should be considered when I talk about my conflicts of interest. This is Richard Nixon signing the National Cancer Act in December of 1971. And this is the beginning of the United States war on cancer, and it's given us a lot of information over the years on cancer. Now, I'm going to talk about overdiagnosis of cancer. This meeting is about overdiagnosis of a number of diseases, but being a cancer doc, I'm going to focus on that. And it's really where overdiagnosis really first started being talked about as an entity. And what I'm going to try to talk about is how can we understand this concept that there are diseases that don't cause harm? After all, what's the meaning of the word disease? Cancer, as many of you or all of you know, is a horrible word and a horrible diagnosis. There's recently a best-selling book called The Emperor of All Maladies, and that speaks for it right there. It is feared. There's been tremendous awareness efforts over the last 100 years, many of them brought about by advocacy organizations that have caused cancer to be incredibly feared. Perhaps the most dreaded phrase in at least the English language is "you have cancer." This has led to the concept that all cancers are bad. All cancers apparently start as a small tumor and then grow and spread and metastasize at some stage. Where do these concepts come from is something that I've been asking myself, and how do we understand this concept that there are cancers that actually don't kill? So what I'm going to talk to you about in the next 15 minutes or so is the first known description of cancer. What is cancer? The concept of pathologic profiling and the changing definition of cancer over time. We're moving in many respects from a mid-19th century definition of cancer to a 21st century definition that includes not just histology, but genetics and genomics. And we're moving to appreciate the biological behaviors of tumors and how the biological behaviors of breast cancer is plural. There's not just one behavior, there are many. Indeed, host is even important. Now, this is found from Egypt. This was actually papyrus that was found in a mummy in 1862 by Edwin Smith. It's a hieroglyphic, and it describes cancer as a tumor against the god Zenus. And for prescription, how to treat it, it says, "Do thou nothing thereagainst." This is the first known writing about cancer. And cancer has been a problem for a long, long time. However, what is cancer? It turns out that our understanding of what is cancer is actually less than 175 years old. Indeed, it's a mid-19th century definition. This gentleman, Rudolf Ludwig Karl Virchow, was a pathologist in Berlin, active throughout much of the 1800s. In the 1850s, he and his students did a series of autopsies, and actually they published a number of books that actually define what cancer is. Virchow worked on much of the current biopsy technology that's still used to this day. He was one of the first people to actually stain tissues. He used the Carmen stain at the time and looked at them under a microscope, and he was a marvelous artist, and he drew pictures of what is today cancer. He is the person who actually figured out that cancer involved uncontrolled cell growth. This is actually a little bit more modern picture of cell mitosis, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and prophase. I just put it in so I could remind Barry Kramer that I can still say that. But he was the first person to actually realize that cells undergo mitosis and that cancer is uncontrolled cell growth or uncontrolled mitosis. He also, through his autopsies, demonstrated that cancer spreads, and it kills through spreading. This is an H&E stain from a biopsy of a localized breast cancer. This is what cancer looks like under the microscope. This is H&E staining. Gerlach, Bämer, and Bayer, the German chemists, they were the people who actually worked out H&E staining in the 1860s and 1870s. But this is an H&E stain of what cancer looks like under the microscope. This can be a localized cancer. This can be a metastatic cancer. This is what an adenocarcinoma actually looks like. And this is a little bit more modern technology. This is a bone scan. And this is a breast cancer which is spread to bone. Okay? The concept that tumors start and that tumors go through uncontrolled mitosis and actually metastasize, that belongs to the German pathologists in the mid-1800s. The histologic definition of cancer used in 2015 is largely that of Virchow and colleagues with very minor modifications. As research has evolved, as science has evolved, our definition of what is cancer is only now starting to evolve. As I say, research and science has evolved. Keep in mind, the definition of cancer is from 1853. X-rays are from the 1890s, mammography in the 1950s, ultrasound in the 50s and 60s, CT scanning in the 70s, MRI in the 80s. Some of the stereotactic biopsy technologies we use today were patented in this century. It is actually possible now that through our new technologies, we can find a 5 or 6 millimeter lesion in a woman's breast through all of these imaging technologies and then stick a needle into it, biopsy it, send it to a pathologist who uses the same technologies that were developed in the 1850s and 1860s, uses a light microscope, which has evolved in that it now has an electric light bulb as a light source, and says, this looks just like what Virchow said killed the woman that he autopsied in 1853. It looks just like something that killed 160 plus years ago. And our assumption is it's going to kill because it looked like something that killed 160 years ago. Those of you in the United States are familiar with racial profiling. This is pathologic profiling. It's currently based on, our definitions of cancer are currently based on morphology and histology defined in the mid-19th century using biopsies done at autopsies. Some of these small, localized 5 millimeter, even 1 centimeter, even 3 centimeter tumors are actually not genomically or genetically programmed to grow, to spread, and to kill. It's that simple. Sometimes they don't grow and spread because of genomics or genetics. Sometimes they can't implant because there's not fertile ground for those tumors to actually implant as metastases, and they die because of a lack of nutrition and oxygenation. Now, overdiagnosis is a difficult concept to comprehend for many people, but I hope that just by explaining that because something is small and looks like something that killed 160 years ago doesn't mean that it's genomically or genetically programmed to kill. And keep in mind, Virchow defined what cancer was under the microscope 30 years before Mendel entered the monastery. So Virchow had no idea about genetics, or certainly had no idea about genomics. The fact that there is something that looks like cancer, that can be cured, and actually doesn't need to be cured, that is cancer overdiagnosis. Now, as we look at lung cancer screening studies, the estimates are 10 to 20% of localized lung cancers found radiologically are overdiagnosis tumors. In the literature, it's between 0 and 50% of mammographically detected breast cancers. Most of us, I think, believe it's more between 10 and 30%, but you can see in the literature 0 to 50%. The proportion of ductal carcinoma in situs that are actually cancer or actually overdiagnosis is probably incredibly high. Indeed, there's, I think, a good conversation going on right now as to whether ductal carcinoma is cancer, and we should talk a little bit more about that in the question and answer period. And 60% or more of prostate cancers detected through PSA are overdiagnosis. So we are moving toward a 21st century definition of what is cancer, and that 21st century definition includes an understanding of varying biologic behaviors. Some are aggressive, some are moderately aggressive, some are non-aggressive. And this 21st century definition is based not just on histology from the 1850s, but also on genetics and genomics. And it also includes an understanding of the varying vulnerabilities of cancer to medical interventions. Indeed, this 21st century definition is telling us a number of molecular targets, some of which are druggable. This is actually a cartoon that many of you are familiar with. Now, pathology and genomic analysis, that is when I say genomics, I mean what genes are present, what genes are not present, how those genes are interacting, whether they're activated or not activated, whether they're overexpressed or underexpressed. And we're actually coming up with various tests. Many of these are out in the market today and still being developed that are actually looking at better defining a cancer through genomics. There's also, most of those tests are currently being used to determine which breast cancer or which prostate cancer is aggressive or non-aggressive, as well as what drugs might be predicted, what drugs might actually be predicted to actually kill the tumor, predictive of disease occurrence as well as response to treatment. So I'm going to sum up by saying what we need to do is move from a 19th century understanding of what is cancer to really a 21st century understanding of what is cancer, using both histology, genetics, and genomics, and appreciate the differences in the biology of the tumor. And I thank you. Under time.
You've done very well, Otis. Thank you very much. Any questions for Otis specifically about his work or talk before we move on? Anyone want to raise? There's a microphone behind you, so if you want to.
While he's going to the microphone,
you carry on.
Dr. Moyer asked the question about DCIS down here. You know, when I was doing clinical pathophysiology at the University of Chicago as a second-year medical student, I distinctly remember the great pathologist Seymour Glagoff, who apparently had discovered Saturday Night Live. And as he was telling us about ductal carcinoma in situ, he explained that true cancer is invasive, and in situ means non-invasive. And so ductal carcinoma in situ is like ductal carcinoma not. And he was hell-bent that DCIS was not cancer. Now, in the 1990s, and I have to be careful how I word this, DCIS became cancer. One organization started calling it stage 0 cancer. Other organizations started benefiting from the fact that instead of 200,000 women diagnosed with cancer, all of a sudden it was 270,000 women diagnosed with cancer. I think we need to get back to basic principles. And it's likely that some things that are DCIS under the microscope really are cancerous, but most that are DCIS under the microscope are not cancerous. And it is clear that we have been over-treating DCIS and doing a disservice to American women, especially, less so in Europe where there's a different view of this, but we've been doing a disservice to women by considering all DCIS to be cancers. I did not say that all DCIS should not be treated. I said we shouldn't be saying that all DCIS is cancer.
Thank you very much for that clarification. I'm going to ask each of you, if you may, just to briefly say...